The castle stones still whisper. If you walk the ruins of medieval England late at night, you may feel it. The cold of the wind cutting across the courtyard, the silence broken only by your own footsteps. But sometimes, in the echoes of that silence, you might imagine the voice of a child, soft, uncertain, trembling, asking why she had been given away. This is not a fairy tale. This is not a story of romance. This is the story of a 6-year-old girl, crowned, married, paraded before the world, and then erased from it. Her husband? A king nearly 5 times her age. Her crown? A burden so heavy it destroyed her childhood before it had even begun. Her legacy? Forgotten, deliberately, violently, as though her very existence threatened the image of England itself. Tonight you and I will walk through her life, not the sanitized version in dusty history books, not the carefully polished portraits made to justify power, but the real story, a story of control, obsession and manipulation, a story that begins with a child, taken from the safety of play and thrust into a marriage bed meant to serve politics rather than love. You're about to discover how one of the youngest brides in royal history was forced into the role of a queen, and why her story was nearly erased from England's memory. But before we peel back the curtain, before we step inside the palace walls where she lived and suffered, let me ask you something. What time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? Comment below. I want to know how far this forgotten queen's voice can travel, and if you're drawn to these hidden, unsettling truths of history, the ones that shatter the illusions of fairy tales, make sure to subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear is not just history, it's a warning. Picture it, England, centuries ago. The court glitters with wealth, but beneath the jewels and silk, there's rot. The air stinks of ambition. Every child of noble birth is not really a child at all, but a pawn, a piece on a board that kings, dukes and bishops shove toward their own advantage. Marriage is not about love. It is about power, about binding 2 rival houses, about cementing influence across kingdoms. And into this game steps a girl too small to even reach the throne that would soon belong to her. She doesn't know the rules. She doesn't understand why men twice her age stare at her like a prize. She doesn't know that her laughter, her innocence, will be stolen in exchange for titles and treaties. But she learns. She learns because she has no choice. The king who chooses her is not in love. He is not searching for companionship. He is searching for control. And in this girl, this fragile, wide-eyed 6-year-old, he sees his opportunity. From the very first day of their union, her life becomes a spectacle. Courtiers whisper, crowds gather, scribes document the moment as though it were a triumph. But the truth is grotesque. A man of 29 binding a child to himself, smiling as though it were destiny. Imagine the wedding, the hall filled with candles, the air suffocating with incense, the nobles dressed in velvet and gold, and at the centre, a tiny figure draped in a gown far too heavy for her small frame. Her crown slips on her head, its weight pressing down like chains. She looks out at faces she doesn't recognize, her small hands trembling as she's told to smile, to bow, to behave like a queen. And the king, he towers over her. He takes her hand, holds it as if sealing a contract, not a marriage. To him, she is a tool, a symbol of power dressed up as a bride. This is where our story begins, with a child bride, with a king who saw her not as human but as property, with a union that should never have happened. But the story doesn't end there, because what followed was not merely a marriage, it was a descent into obsession, manipulation and tragedy, a descent that would swallow her entire identity until history itself tried to bury her name. As you sit here listening to this, think of her, not as a queen, not as a pawn, but as a child who should have been playing in gardens, learning to read, laughing with friends. Instead, she stood in a cold stone hall, draped in silk that wasn't hers, surrounded by men who would never let her be free. And the question that should burn in your mind is this: why? Why was she chosen? Why was her story silenced? And why, after centuries, does she still haunt the edges of England's forgotten past? Because tonight you'll learn the truth, and once you hear it, you will never think of royal crowns the same way again. To understand why a 6-year-old girl was bound to a man nearly 5 times her age, we need to step back. Step out of the wedding hall. Step away from the jeweled crown on her tiny head. Step into the corridors of power where whispers shape destinies, where bloodlines were played like cards, and where every promise made in ink became a noose around a child's life. England in the Middle Ages was a kingdom both powerful and fragile. Outwardly, the crown glimmered with strength, its armies, its churches, its sprawling estates. But behind the glitter lay cracks. The throne was never just a seat, it was a battlefield. Every king feared rebellion, every nobleman feared betrayal, and every dynasty feared extinction. Bloodlines were the glue that held kingdoms together, and marriage was the weapon that enforced it. For a king in his late 20s, one who needed legitimacy, loyalty, and heirs, the search for a bride was not about affection, it was about calculation. And the girl chosen, this forgotten queen, was not select D for her smile, her innocence, or her spirit. She was chosen for her family name, for the alliances she could secure, and for the image she could project. Her parents knew, her court knew. And yet, no one spoke of it as cruelty, they spoke of it as necessity. Imagine being her mother, perhaps weeping quietly as her child was prepared for marriage, yet unable to refuse the king's demand. To resist would mean ruin, to comply meant sacrifice. And so the mother watched as her daughter's childhood was signed away with the stroke of a quill. To the courtiers, this child was not a daughter, she was a promise of peace between rival houses, a promise of heirs to secure the throne, a promise of stability in a world where even stability was a mask for constant unrest. But promises in royal courts are never pure, they are poisoned with ambition. Every smile hides a dagger, every toast to the happy couple masks the gnashing of teeth by rivals who wish to see the union fail. The church sanctified it. The bishops nodded, cloaked in incense and scripture, declaring the marriage holy, as though God himself had blessed this grotesque imbalance. They invoked the language of destiny, of providence, of divine order, as if a child could ever comprehend what was being forced upon her. The scriptures wrapped chains around her wrists more tightly than any rope ever could. And so the people cheered, or rather, they pretended to, because what choice did they have? The king smiled, the child curtsied, and the illusion of harmony was presented to the masses. But inside the palace walls, unease simmered. The king's counselors knew he had married for power, not companionship. They whispered about the age gap, about the risks, about the grotesque theatre of it all, but no one dared confront him directly. To speak against a king was to risk exile, imprisonment, or death. Meanwhile, the girl herself was being reshaped. Day by day, she was drilled in etiquette, instructed in how to speak, how to move, how to carry herself not as a child but as a queen. Dolls and games were replaced with scrolls and prayers. Laughter was replaced with lessons. Tears were replaced with silence. And yet she resisted in ways small and invisible to most. A stumble during a ceremony, a glance toward the window during a sermon, a child's instinct to cling to freedom, to seek the outside world even when every door was locked. Her resistance wasn't rebellion, it was survival. This is the context most histories erase. They'll tell you she was a queen, but they won't tell you she was a child who wanted to run through fields, not corridors. They'll tell you she was married, but they won't tell you about the sleepless nights where she cried into her pillows, longing for a life she would never have. They'll tell you her crown was golden, but they won't tell you how it dug into her scalp until her head ached. And the king? He saw her not with tenderness, but with obsession. To him, she was a symbol of his authority, a reminder to his enemies that he could command even the innocence of a child to his will. He treated her less as a wife and more as a possession, parading her at court gatherings as though she were evidence of his power. Outside the palace, whispers grew. Among the peasants, the marriage was unsettling. They murmured that the union was unnatural, that God would not bless such a thing. In taverns and markets, people told stories in hushed tones about the child queen, shaking their heads as though they had glimpsed a curse settling over the kingdom. Because deep down, everyone knew something about this was wrong. Something about this marriage was a wound, not a blessing, a shadow, not a promise. And yet, life moved forward. The girl grew older, the king grew more possessive, the crown grew heavier. This was the context of her life. A promise made not to her, but on her behalf. A promise that erased her voice. A promise that would chain her to a man, to a throne, to a destiny she never asked for. But promises have a way of unraveling, and the threads of this one, woven with ambition, soaked in fear and pulled taut by power, would soon begin to snap. What happens when a promise is kept not for love but for control? What happens when a child grows into a woman inside a prison made of silk and stone? The answer lies in her rise. A rise that was not hers by choice but by force, a rise that would pull her deeper into the king's shadow until she began to disappear entirely. And that is where we must go next. The child bride had been crowned, the ink of treaties had dried, the nobles had bowed, and so began the slow, suffocating climb that history would later call her rise. But do not mistake the word for triumph. For her, the rise was not a soaring into freedom or glory, it was the tightening of chains around her wrists. Day by day, she was moulded, reshaped into an image of queenship. Her childhood slipped away like sand through clenched fingers. Tutors descended upon her, drilling her in languages, scripture, ceremony, and the endless list of gestures that made a monarch appear divine. Every smile had to be measured. Glance had to be deliberate. Every word had to fall like music. At 6 years old, she was taught how to bow with grace. At 7, how to command silence with a look. At 8, how to pray not as a girl, but as a sovereign whose voice was supposed to echo heaven itself. Her rise was a performance. She was both actor and prisoner, her stage the throne, her script written by others, her audience, courtiers hungry for weakness. The king watched closely. He was not a husband in the tender sense. He was more like a sculptor, shaping clay that could not resist him. He insisted she walk beside him in public, though her small steps struggled to keep pace. He corrected her posture, her tone, her very breath, until she was less a person and more a shadow cast by his will. And yet, there was danger in shadows. For every time she appeared at his side, she reminded the court and the kingdom of the grotesque imbalance of their union. The whispers did not die. If anything, they grew louder. Nobles spoke of her beauty, yes, but in tones that carried unease, because she was still a child. Diplomats smiled politely, but behind closed doors they questioned the king's judgment. Was this truly strength, or was it desperation masquerading as power? The girl herself began to sense it. She was clever, more clever than anyone expected. She learned to listen while pretending not to. She absorbed the currents of fear and ambition that swirled around her. She began to realize that she was both queen and hostage, revered and reviled, lifted high only to be pulled down again. Her rise was marked not by victories, but by ceremonies. Processions through towns where peasants gathered to watch her tiny frame draped in gowns that dragged across cobblestones. Feasts where she sat silently beside the king, her feet dangling above the floor while nobles toasted her as though she were the Virgin born. Each appearance was a spectacle, and each spectacle tightened the knot between them. Inside she felt the walls closing, but outwardly she rose. By the time she was 10, the transformation was almost complete. The child was hidden behind layers of silk, etiquette, and fear. Her laughter was gone, but in its place was a kind of poise that unsettled those who saw it. She had learned how to endure the gaze of men twice, 3 times her age. She had learned how to smile when her stomach knotted with dread. She had learned the art of silence, the silence that screams louder than words. The king was proud. He saw in her the perfect projection of his authority. He paraded her as though she were proof that he commanded even innocence itself, but pride curdled quickly into obsession. He watched her too closely. He demanded her presence at times when other queens might have been left alone. He wanted her near, always near, as though afraid she might slip from his grasp. It was during this time that her name began to spread beyond England's borders. Foreign courts heard of the child queen married to a king, and the tale carried both fascination and horror. To some, it was evidence of England's power, that even its monarch could twist the natural order to his will. To others, it was evidence of corruption, a kingdom so desperate to secure its throne that it sacrificed innocence on the altar of ambition. The rise was not hers, it was his. He rose on her back, his authority gleaming brighter because of the shadow he cast over her. And yet, the higher he rose, the more fragile his throne became. For every noble that bowed, another whispered. For every alliance strengthened, another frayed. And through it all, she remained the silent center of a storm. But storms do not stay silent forever. She began to grow. Slowly, year by year, she shed the frame of a child and stepped toward womanhood. And with each year, something in her hardened. The eyes that once brimmed with tears began to sharpen. The silence that once came from fear began to hold a different kind of power. She was still trapped, still bound, but she was learning the subtle art of survival, the art of being underestimated. No one saw it yet. To the king, she was still his possession, his child queen, his proof of dominance. To the court, she was still a pawn, her fate tied to treaties and heirs. But in the quiet of her chambers, in the long hours where only candlelight kept her company, she began to wonder, what if she could turn the game against them? The rise was not complete, it was only beginning, for as she grew, so did the tension between the image forced upon her and the person she was becoming, and soon that tension would crack the walls of the palace itself, because the king's obsession was deepening, and obsession, in the hands of a man who already believed himself chosen by God, is a dangerous thing. The girl was rising, but the king's obsession was rising faster, and together their ascent would lead not to stability, but to a precipice that neither of them could escape. Next, we must step into the heart of that obsession. By now, she was no longer just a child bride. She was a fixture of the court, a silent presence draped in silk, seated beside the king like an ornament of legitimacy. But beneath the gilded surface, something unsettling had begun to take root. The king's gaze lingered too long, his grip on her hand was too firm. His need to have her constantly at his side began to overshadow even the business of ruling. What began as political strategy was curdling into something far more dangerous: obsession. The king had always been ambitious, always restless. His marriage to her was supposed to solidify his throne, to calm the storms of rebellion and unrest. But instead of focusing on his kingdom, he began to focus on her. Her presence soothed him. Her silence reassured him. Her obedience became the balm to his insecurities. He could not bear for her to be out of sight, as though without her his crown might slip. Everywhere she went, he followed. At council meetings, she was made to sit in the corner, her small frame swallowed by velvet chairs, her eyes forced to witness the endless disputes of lords. At ceremonies, he kept her so close that their shadows overlapped, a grotesque reminder of how little space she was allowed to claim for herself. Even in private, the king demanded her company, long hours where she sat by him as he pored over documents, her presence treated like a protective charm rather than a person. It was suffocating, but worse, it was consuming. The obsession twisted into rituals. He demanded that she speak to him before bed, her child's voice softening his paranoia. He insisted she be present during his prayers, as if her nearness sanctified his devotion. He began to believe that her very existence validated his kingship, that without her, he was vulnerable to betrayal, to rebellion, to God's wrath. And yet the court began to notice cracks. Nobles whispered that the king no longer cared for matters of governance as he once had. His decisions grew erratic, swayed not by logic but by moods that rose and fell with her presence. Some said he was bewitched by her, that she held a strange, unnatural sway over him. Others claimed it was madness, that his obsession was not love but delusion, a symptom of power rotting from within. The truth was more disturbing still. She had no power. None of it was her choice. She was not manipulating him. She was enduring him. But perception is everything in courts of power, and perception began to warp her image. To the common people, she was an innocent victim, the child queen whose life had been stolen. To the nobles, she was a phantom influence, her silence mistaken for cunning, her youth mistaken for strategy. And to the king, she was no longer a wife nor even a queen. She was a possession, an object, a mirror in which he saw his greatness reflected back. For her, the obsession was terrifying. Imagine being so young, forced to carry the unbearable weight of another's fixation. Every word you speak is monitored, every glance is interpreted, every step you take is shadowed. You have no room to breathe, no room to be yourself. Your very existence has been swallowed by someone else's hunger for control. She tried to resist in small ways. She lingered in gardens longer than permitted, staring at the world beyond the palace walls as if freedom might rise on the horizon. She spoke less, retreating into silence so that nothing she said could be twisted into chains. She found solace in the stillness of nights, whispering prayers not to the God her husband worshipped, but to any spirit that might listen, begging for escape. But the king noticed. Obsession sharpens perception. He saw her distance, and it frightened him. Fear in him turned quickly to control. He tightened her schedule. He restricted her movements. He surrounded her with attendants who reported her every action back to him. The palace, once gilded, became a prison of surveillance. And yet, even as she suffocated, she began to see something the king could not. His obsession was weakness. The more he clung to her, the less his nobles respected him. The more he demanded her presence, the more they doubted his strength. She became his crutch, and in a world of wolves, a king with a crutch is a king marked for slaughter. Obsession corrodes not only the obsessed, but everything around them. Soon, even his most loyal advisors grew restless. They urged him to focus on governance, on heirs, on wars and alliances. But he could not. His fixation on her eclipsed everything. And beneath that fixation lay a darker truth. He was haunted. Haunted by the fragility of his throne. Haunted by the whispers of rebellion. Haunted by the fear that God himself might strip the crown from his head. And in her, the child queen, he saw the only anchor he had left. For her, the nightmare deepened. The king's love, if you could call it that, was suffocating. His gaze became a cage, his touch became a chain, his voice became a command that could not be ignored. But obsession has a way of burning itself out. It cannot last forever. The tighter he held her, the more cracks began to form. And one day an event would strike, a catalyst that would turn this grotesque obsession into something even more dangerous. The court would not forget it, the kingdom would not forgive it, and she would never escape it. Every story has a fracture. A moment where the carefully constructed mask slips, and beneath it, the rot is revealed. For the child queen, the fracture came not in whispers, but in spectacle, an event that forced her husband's obsession into the open and set in motion the chain of tragedies that would define the rest of her short life. The catalyst was not one moment alone, but a convergence. The king's paranoia, the nobles' unrest, the people's unease, all collided in a scene so unforgettable that even the chroniclers, loyal to the throne, could not disguise its horror. It began with pressure. The council had grown restless. Years had passed since the marriage, and still there was no heir. Whispers of God's displeasure grew louder, fueling rumors that the union was cursed. The nobles pressed the king, secure the line, prove the legitimacy of your rule, give us a future to rally behind. But how could he? She was still a child, her body was not yet ready to bear children, and every physician knew it. Yet politics does not wait for nature. And the king, driven by obsession, driven by fear, decided to force the issue. A ceremony was arranged, a grotesque theatre designed to silence doubts. In the great hall, before the nobles and the clergy, the king presented her not as a girl, but as a queen mature enough to carry the weight of succession. He dressed her in finery too heavy for her frame, jewels that bruised her skin, gowns that trailed across the floor like chains of gold. He announced to the court that his marriage was fruitful, that God had blessed their union, that an heir was inevitable, and then he did something that would never be forgotten. He commanded her to stand before them all, to speak, to prove with her tiny, trembling voice that she was a queen prepared to serve her king, her God, and her kingdom. The hall was silent. All eyes bore into her, the weight of expectation pressing down like a physical force. She was no longer a child in their eyes. She was an object, a vessel, a womb disguised as royalty. Her hands shook, her lips quivered. She tried to remember the words drilled into her by tutors. She tried to summon the poise beaten into her by endless lessons, but the moment was too heavy. She faltered, her voice cracked, and in that instant the illusion shattered. Gasps rippled through the hall, nobles exchanged glances, priests muttered prayers, and the king, his face twisted with rage and shame, clutched her arm so tightly she winced. That was the catalyst, not her silence, not her failure, but his reaction. For the first time the court saw it clearly. They saw the desperation in his grip, the madness in his eyes, the grotesque imbalance of power between a towering man and a fragile girl. They saw not a sovereign couple, but a cruel spectacle, a child being paraded like livestock before men who called themselves holy. And once seen, it could not be unseen. The whispers grew sharper. Some said the king was cursed, others said the girl was bewitched, her innocence turned into a snare. Still others whispered of rebellion, of God's wrath, of a kingdom that had abandoned its moral compass. For her, the catalyst was even more brutal. That night, behind closed doors, the king's fury erupted. He blamed her for the humiliation, for faltering, for revealing his weakness. His voice thundered against stone walls, his rage echoing in chambers where she had no escape. He told her she was his possession, his queen, his proof of destiny, and that she would never fail him again. From that night on, the obsession grew darker, the surveillance tighter, the pressure unbearable. Every move she made was scrutinized, every word rehearsed. She was drilled like a soldier preparing for battle, not against enemies at the gates, but against the ever-watchful gaze of her own husband. And yet, within that crucible of cruelty, something inside her began to change. The catalyst was not only his breaking point, it was hers. For the first time, she understood that survival would require more than silence, more than endurance. She would need to adapt, to play the role so perfectly that no one could find fault. She would need to wear the mask so convincingly that even the king himself could not see the resistance burning quietly beneath it. The catalyst taught her this, that her life was no longer her own, but that within the prison of her role, she could carve out slivers of control, a glance here, a pause there, a silence that spoke louder than obedience. But it also taught her something else, that the king's obsession was spiraling toward madness, that the more he clung to her, the more his throne crumbled beneath him, that the marriage meant to secure the kingdom had instead become its greatest weakness. The catalyst was not a single night, it was a chain reaction. From that moment onward, the balance of power began to tilt. The king lost the respect of his court, the people grew restless, the church grew wary, and the girl, once a pawn, began to see the cracks in the board. History remembers kings for their victories, their battles, their conquests, but sometimes the downfall of a king begins not on the battlefield, but in a single moment of weakness, gripping the arm of a trembling child, revealing to the world that his crown was built on obsession, not strength. And that was the beginning of the end. Next comes the transformation, the moment when the child bride, forced into silence, begins to turn silence into weapon. The catalyst had been set in motion. The king's obsession was no longer hidden behind ceremony and ritual. It had burst into the open, staining his rule with whispers of madness. For the girl, it was the moment she realized that silence alone would not save her. To endure, to survive, she would have to change, and change she did. Transformation does not happen in a single heartbeat. It is not thunder cracking across the sky. It is slow, deliberate, the way a flame eats away at a candle until its shape is unrecognizable. For the child queen, the transformation began with observation. She watched, she listened, she learned. The palace was her prison, but also her classroom. Every whisper that echoed through the corridors taught her something about power. Every banquet where nobles raised goblets in false cheer revealed to her the language of masks. Every outburst from her husband showed her the fragility of kingship. And in silence, she grew sharper. No longer did she cry when he gripped her arm too tightly. No longer did she flinch when his voice thundered through the chambers. Instead, she became still, composed. She wore obedience like armor, her star. Allness a shield against his storms, and in that stillness she discovered something unexpected: control. Because silence unnerved him. When she did not react, when she did not tremble, when her face became unreadable, he grew unsettled. He could not measure her thoughts, and his obsession fed on knowing. Her transformation into silence was her first act of rebellion, small, invisible, but powerful. But the transformation went deeper. She began to play the role so convincingly that even the court believed it. At ceremonies, her voice no longer quivered. At feasts, her smile no longer faltered. At processions, her small figure moved with the grace of someone twice her age. The nobles, once skeptical, began to marvel. They called her poised, mature, regal. They mistook her survival for submission. The king, blinded by obsession, saw only confirmation of his own greatness. He boasted that she had been molded into the perfect queen. He paraded her more than ever, convinced that her composure reflected his divine right. What he did not see was that she was learning to wield the very tools he had forced upon her. Every lesson drilled into her, the posture, the poise, the silence, she now used for herself. She turned her mask into a weapon, and though she was still bound, still caged, she was no longer powerless. The transformation was not just internal, it was physical. She was growing. Each year the child faded, and a young woman began to emerge, and with that shift came a change in how others perceived her. No longer simply a pawn, she became the subject of rumor, of fascination, even of fear. Some whispered that she had bewitched the king, that her silence was sorcery. Others believed she was cursed, that the unnatural marriage had tainted her with a shadow that followed wherever she walked. For her, these whispers were dangerous, but also useful. They gave her a reputation, a kind of presence that extended beyond the cage of her body. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer just the child bride. She was something more enigmatic, something less controllable, and she used that. In private, she cultivated small acts of resistance, a glance that lingered a moment too long on a sympathetic courtier, a silence that fell heavy after the king's boasts, a prayer uttered not at the altar but in solitude, where she asked not for salvation but for strength. She learned to survive not by breaking chains but by turning them into instruments. Yet the transformation came at a cost. To endure, she had to bury pieces of herself. The child who once laughed at gardens was gone. The girl who once whispered dreams into the night was silent. Each layer of poise, each act of composure demanded that she sacrifice something of her true self, and though she was becoming stronger, she was also becoming hollowed, shaped by necessity into something she never chose to be. The king, meanwhile, continued to unravel. His obsession deepened, his reliance on her presence growing unbearable. He demanded that she not only be at his side, but reflect his every mood, his every triumph, his every fear. And when she mastered the art of silence, he mistook it for devotion. He believed she was his anchor, his confidant, his divine partner. He could not see that beneath the stillness burned a will he could never crush. Transformation is dangerous, because once a pawn realizes it can think, it is no longer a pawn. Once silence becomes choice rather than command, it becomes a weapon. Once the girl learned she could endure, she began to imagine something greater, that she might one day outlast him. The court too began to shift. Nobles who once saw her as irrelevant now noticed her composure. Foreign envoys who once pitied her now respected the aura she projected. The transformation did not free her, but it changed the way others viewed her, and in courts of power, perception is everything. She was still trapped, still bound, still the possession of a king who saw her as his proof of destiny, but she was no longer helpless. She had transformed, and in that transformation lay the seeds of a power no one expected her to wield. The king had made her into a queen, but he had also made her into something more dangerous, a woman who could survive him. And survival, in the Game of Thrones, is the deadliest power of all. Next comes the spectacle, the moment when her transformation is displayed before the world, when the mask she has crafted becomes both her shield and her prison. The mask she had forged in silence was about to be tested. No longer confined to the whispered corridors of the palace, her composure would soon become a weapon wielded on the greatest stage of all, before the entire kingdom. For the child queen, now stepping into the body of a young woman, the moment had come when she could no longer hide her transformation. The world would see her, and the world would judge. It began with ceremony. In medieval England, kings did not simply rule, they performed. Power was not only maintained with swords and armies, but with pageantry, ritual, and the constant spectacle of divine favor. The king, obsessed with proving his destiny, knew this better than anyone, and he believed his young queen was the jewel in his crown, the living proof of his chosen greatness. So he displayed her. The first grand procession was unlike anything the kingdom had seen. The streets were lined with peasants who pressed against one another for a glimpse of the girl whose marriage had already become a legend whispered in taverns and churches. Nobles in silks and jewels paraded alongside soldiers in polished armor. Trumpets blared, incense burned, the air was thick with the weight of ceremony, and then she appeared. Seated beside the king, dressed in robes that seemed to swallow her thin frame, she did not tremble, she did not frown, she did not betray fear. She sat with her back straight, her gaze steady, her face an unreadable mask of poise. The people gasped. They had expected a child, a fragile figure dwarfed by the crown. Instead, they saw something uncanny, an almost spectral presence, too composed for her years, too still for her age. It was unsettling, it was haunting, and it was unforgettable. The king beamed, mistaking her composure for devotion. To him, this was proof that his will had triumphed, that his young queen reflected the divine harmony of his reign. He paraded her through cathedral doors, through banquet halls, through the echoing chambers of power. At every feast, she was expected to raise her cup at the right moment, to smile at the right jest, to bow her head at the right prayer. And she did, flawlessly. But what the king did not understand was that every flawless act tightened the mask, every perfected gesture made her less his possession and more her own creation. The spectacle that was supposed to glorify him was slowly giving her a stage to wield her silent strength. And the people noticed. In the whispers of the crowd her image grew. Some saw her as tragic, a child forced into a woman's role, her poise a shield against torment. Others saw her as mystical, a queen touched by something beyond human. How else could a girl so young endure such weight without breaking? The myths grew, and with them, her power. Spectacle is dangerous because it distorts. What begins as show becomes legend, and legends live longer than kings. Behind the dazzling robes and glittering crowns, however, the reality was darker. For every grand feast there were nights of silence where she sat alone, staring into cold walls, reminding herself not to cry. For every procession where tears rose in the air, there were moments of terror when the king's grip tightened on her arm until bruises bloomed. The spectacle was not her life, it was her prison made visible. But in that prison, she had found a strange kind of agency. She learned to manipulate perception. A glance held too long could spark a rumor. A carefully timed smile could win sympathy. A moment of stillness could shift a hall's attention. She became fluent in the language of spectacle, understanding that in courts of power, what is seen is often more powerful than what is true. And still, the king basked in it. He believed the people adored him because of her presence. He believed nobles respected him because of her composure. He did not realize that the spectacle was slipping out of his control, that the more he paraded her, the more she became her own figure, her own myth, her own silent sovereign. The grandest of all spectacles came at the festival of midsummer, when the king declared a feast to rival any in Europe. Torches lit the night sky until it blazed like day. Minstrels played songs that shook the air. Tables groaned with roasted meats, honeyed breads, and goblets overflowing with wine. And at the center sat the king and his queen. All eyes turned to her. The hall waited. Would she falter? Would she tremble? Would she for once break the mask? But she did not. She lifted her goblet with grace, met the gaze of hundreds without blinking, and drank. The hall erupted with cheers, the sound like thunder rolling through stone. It was in that moment she realized something chilling. She was no longer merely surviving the spectacle, she was commanding it. But power gained in silence is a double-edged blade. The more she commanded attention, the more the king's obsession tightened. He needed her not just at his side, but as the very reflection of his rule. His madness deepened, for the brighter she shone in the eyes of the people, the more he feared losing her. The spectacle had elevated her, it had given her presence, myth, and strength, but it had also chained her more tightly to a man who saw her not as a person, but as the stage on which his destiny was performed. And deep within her, the cracks were widening. For how long could one wear the mask before it became the face itself? How long could one endure the spectacle before it consumed what little self remained? The kingdom cheered, the nobles whispered, the king obsessed, and the queen waited. Because she knew that every spectacle ends, every mask eventually slips, and when it did, the fall would be catastrophic. Every spectacle has a breaking point. Every mask, no matter how finely crafted, eventually fractures. For the child queen, the fall did not come suddenly, like lightning ripping the sky. It came slowly, like a rope tightening around her neck, each day pulling tighter, each whisper cutting deeper, until the air itself grew thin. The king's obsession, once paraded as divine devotion, began to decay into paranoia. His eyes, once filled with the triumphant pride of possession, now burned with fear. He had built his rule upon the illusion of harmony, upon the image of a young queen who reflected his greatness. But illusions are fragile things, and the more the people whispered of her strength, the more he felt his own slipping. At first, the cracks appeared in private. Nights that once ended with the king demanding her presence now ended in rage. His words, once wrapped in honeyed obsession, turned sharp with suspicion. "Why do they look at you more than me?" he would mutter, pacing the chambers like a man haunted by shadows. "Why do they whisper your name in the halls?" His questions were daggers not meant to be answered, and when she met them with silence, his fury only deepened. The child queen, now nearly grown, no longer trembled, but inside she felt the air shifting. She knew that when obsession curdles into fear, destruction follows. Then the cracks spilled into public view. At a grand council meeting with nobles and bishops seated in solemn rows, the king demanded her presence at his side. But when he spoke, his words faltered, his voice broke, his sentences looped, his eyes darted toward her as if begging for reassurance. Whispers rippled through the chamber. It was not the queen who seemed fragile, it was the king. And the whispers spread like fire. Nobles who once admired his strength began to question his mind. Priests who once praised his divine favor began to murmur about judgment. Foreign envoys returned home with tales not of a mighty king, but of a ruler whose obsession had corroded his reason. The queen's mask, her poise, her silence, it no longer reflected his power, it exposed his weakness. He began to lash out, at courtiers, at priests, at her. Doors slammed, goblets shattered, words like venom spilled across the halls. The man who once believed himself destined now resembled a cornered animal, gnashing at everything he could not control, and at the center of his fury was the girl who had once been his jewel. The fall deepened when rumors of betrayal took root. Some whispered that the queen had bewitched him with unnatural powers. Others claimed she plotted with rival nobles, her silence hiding conspiracies too dangerous to name. None of it was true, yet in courts of power truth matters less than perception, and perception was already a knife at the king's throat. For the queen, each day became a test of survival. She walked the palace like a shadow, careful not to provoke, careful not to draw the wrong gaze. Yet no matter how still she remained, his paranoia followed. He began to question her every word, her every glance, her every absence. Even silence, once her weapon, became dangerous, for silence to him now meant defiance. The fall was not only political, it was personal. There were nights when the king would lock the chamber doors and demand she kneel in prayer beside him for hours, muttering that God must bind them closer. There were days when he would order her paraded through the streets again, as if the cheers of the crowd might drown the whispers in his mind, and there were moments, fleeting but terrifying, when his eyes no longer saw her as queen or wife or even child, but as an enemy. The court grew restless. Nobles exchanged glances in shadowed corners, servants whispered of madness, and always the question lingered, how long could this reign last before it collapsed? The queen herself felt the walls closing in, her mask still held, but beneath it, cracks spread through her soul. She was no longer the child forced into silence. She was no longer the young bride paraded as proof of destiny. She was a woman now, hardened by survival, but haunted by the pieces of herself she had buried along the way. And as she watched the king unravel, she realized that her fate was bound to his fall. Because when kings collapse, queens are dragged with them. The final act of the fall came not with a single event, but with a pattern too visible to ignore. The king stopped attending councils altogether. He shut himself in chambers, muttering prayers, demanding rituals, summoning priests who fled his presence in fear. And when he did appear, his words were broken, his gestures frantic, his eyes wild. The people no longer cheered in the streets. They watched in silence. Their awe turned to pity. Their pity turned to fear. And beside him, the queen stood still, her mask never slipping, her silence unbroken. To the world, she was the calm shadow beside the storm. But inside, she knew the truth. The fall was nearly complete. What happens when a king loses his crown in the eyes of his people? What happens when a marriage built on spectacle rots from the inside out? The answer was coming, swift and merciless. The fall of the king was not just his own. It was the unraveling of an entire illusion, an illusion that had cost her childhood, her freedom, and perhaps her very self. And in the silence that followed, one question burned brighter than all the rest. Would she survive the ruin of the man who had consumed her life? The fall was here, but the aftermath, the reckoning, was yet to come. The fall of a king is never quiet. Thrones do not crumble in silence. They collapse with a roar that shakes palaces, with whispers that poison courts, with screams that echo down stone corridors. Yet when the king finally broke, what followed was stranger than chaos. It was silence, an eerie, suffocating silence that hung over the realm like a shroud. He had been the axis upon which the illusion spun. His obsession, his parades, his ceremonies, they had held together a fragile kingdom of spectacle. When he cracked, the illusion shattered, and the fragments cut everyone who had once believed in it. The child queen, now no longer a child but still far younger than the world remembered, found herself standing in the wreckage. The man who had stolen her youth, the man who had paraded her like a living relic, was no longer her tormentor. He was a husk, a shadow of himself, whispered about with pity and disgust. The courtiers who once bowed too deeply now smirked behind his back. The peasants who once cheered his processions, no. Without the king's obsession, she was adrift. For years her identity had been chained to his, the child bride, the jewel of his crown, the reflection of his greatness, the mask of his decline. Now, as he withered, so too did the structure that had defined her existence. Who was she, without his obsession to shape her? The court had its answer. She was an object of suspicion. Rumours swelled in the void. Some whispered she had bewitched him, draining his sanity drop by drop. Others claimed she was the curse of their union, a divine punishment visited upon the realm. Still others suggested she was not queen at all, but prisoner, a victim dressed in robes, a girl caught in a story she could never escape. The aftermath of spectacle is always ugly. Without the mask of ceremony, people see what they want to see, and in her they saw everything: enchantress, victim, saint, traitor. Each gaze was a weight, each whisper a wound. For the queen herself, the aftermath was lonelier still. She had grown accustomed to surviving in the king's shadow, but now that shadow was disintegrating. She walked the palace halls like a ghost, her steps echoing in chambers once filled with music. Servants avoided her eyes, nobles bowed without warmth, even the priests hesitated when she approached the altar. It was as if she carried his madness with her, as if his downfall had stained her soul, and yet she endured. The strength she had cultivated, the mask, the silence, the poise, did not abandon her. If anything, they deepened. She had no illusions left to protect, no king to appease, no crowd to charm. What remained was endurance, pure, unflinching endurance, the kind that does not glitter, does not dazzle, but simply survives. Still, the aftermath demanded a price. Whispers turned into accusations. Accusations became petitions. There were voices in council that argued she should be cast aside. Lo, arced away in a convent, erased from the memory of the crown. She was too strange, too haunting, too indelibly linked to his madness. And though these arguments never prevailed, the threat lingered like smoke after fire. At any moment her existence could be rewritten, her identity erased. The king, meanwhile, decayed before her eyes. His once commanding figure slumped into a shell of muttering prayers and broken gestures. His obsession had devoured him, and now, like a beast starved of prey, it devoured itself. There were nights when she heard him calling her name in the dark, not as a wife, not as a queen, but as a phantom that haunted his dreams. She did not answer. She could not. For what was left to say? The aftermath was not triumph, it was not freedom, it was survival in its most hollow form. She had endured him, endured the spectacle, endured the fall, but what remained of her? Some nights she stood before the mirror and did not recognize her own reflection. The child was gone. The girl was gone. In their place stood a figure who looked regal, poised, untouchable. But beneath the crown, beneath the robes, she felt like a shadow, a hollow echo carved out by years of endurance. And yet, even in this emptiness, there was a seed of something dangerous, because to survive destruction is to hold knowledge others fear. She had seen the inside of obsession, the fragility of thrones, the madness that festers behind ceremony. She knew what few dared admit, that kings are not gods, but men, weak, desperate, and doomed. The aftermath was her inheritance. But inheritances are not chosen, they are imposed, and hers was one of scars, of silence, of truths too heavy to speak aloud. Still, she carried it, because what else could she do? And as the court drifted further into whispers, as the king withered into irrelevance, as her own identity blurred into myth, one question remained. Was she forgotten, or was she waiting? For sometimes the aftermath is not an ending, sometimes it is only the silence before the final revelation. And her revelation, the lesson she would leave behind, the truth no one expected, was still to come. History has a cruel way of swallowing lives whole. The faces fade, the voices are silenced. The stories are buried beneath marble, beneath scripture, beneath the dust of centuries. And yet some ghosts refuse to stay silent. The child queen, the girl who was married at 6 to a man nearly 5 times her age, still lingers, though her name is rarely spoken, though her face is absent from the portraits of glory. She lingers because her life was not just a story of one forgotten queen, but of something larger, something that echoes through every era. Her lesson is not written in victory. It is not carved in triumphal arches or celebrated in ballads. It is written in silence, in endurance, in the spaces between screams. It is the lesson of survival in a world that saw her as nothing but a pawn. What does it mean to be remembered? For kings, it meant monuments. For conquerors, it meant songs. But for her, memory was a battlefield. Some saw her as victim, others as manipulator. Some called her cursed, others saintly. Few asked who she truly was beneath the mask. And that is the tragedy and the warning. The lesson is this: when a life is forced into spectacle, the person vanishes, the role consumes them, the child is erased, the woman is hollowed, the queen is all that remains, and even she is not truly human but a reflection of the crown's shadow. And yet even in that erasure she left behind something powerful, because she endured. That word, endure, sounds small, but it is immense. To endure is to survive when survival seems impossible. To endure is to carry scars the world refuses to see. To endure is to exist when others would erase you. And in endurance lies a quiet defiance, one that outlasts kings, crowns, and thrones. Her king, the man who consumed her childhood, who paraded her as proof of his destiny, who fell into madness and left her surrounded by whispers. He is remembered only in fragments, as another ruler whose reign cracked under the weight of obsession. But she, though forgotten by name, lives on in the unsettling story of the child bride who became queen, who survived him, who carried his ruin without breaking. The lesson is not comfortable. It forces us to look at the way power consumes innocence, the way history repeats cruelty in new forms, the way silence is often the only weapon left to the powerless. And it asks us, asks you, what kind of world allows such stories to exist at all? It is easy to look away, to call it the past, to convince ourselves that these horrors are relics of another age. But are they? How many children even now are sacrificed to power, to greed, to ambition? How many voices are still silenced by spectacle, forced into roles they did not choose, erased in the name of tradition? Her life whispers to us across time, reminding us that history is not just a record of rulers and battles. It is a graveyard of silenced lives, and in those silences lie lessons sharper than swords. So what do we take from her? We take this, that survival is not weakness, that endurance is not submission, that silence can be both prison and rebellion, and that even the most forgotten figures can hold up a mirror to the cruelty of their age and ours. The child queen never chose her fate, but she teaches us still to look closer at the stories we are told, to question the masks of power, to remember the voices erased. And maybe, if we remember her, not just the queen, not just the pawn, but the child who once laughed, who once dreamed, we honor something deeper. We honor the humanity stolen from her. So as you sit here listening, ask yourself, what time is it where you are? Where are you watching from? Because time passes, centuries shift, kings and queens fall into dust. But these stories remain, waiting for someone, waiting for you to hear them, to remember them, to refuse to let silence win. Her name may be absent from monuments, but tonight, in your memory, she lives again. And that is the final lesson. Sometimes the greatest act of resistance is simply to be remembered. If this story struck you, if it unsettled you, haunted you, or opened your eyes to a forgotten truth, then I ask you, do not let it end here. Share it, speak it, keep it alive. Subscribe to this channel for more stories buried in the shadows of history, stories they never wanted you to know. Comment below with your thoughts. Was she victim, survivor, or something more? And above all, never stop questioning the past, because the past is never really gone. The child bride who became queen endures still.